I'd like us all to give a warm Entrepreneurship Hour welcome to Shane Green. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. That was great. Thank you. Hey there. Thanks for having me today. It's exciting to be on North Campus. I wasn't quite sure where it was. I was an LSA poli-sci history major, so I'm very excited to be here. I also want to acknowledge Dana Budson, who's actually here with us today, who's my co-founder of UBDI. She got accepted at the University of Michigan Engineering School and accepted and then backed out at the last minute. So we're still trying to get her excited about coming back in some way. So welcome Dana, and we'll have some interesting information about UBDI to share in a few moments. But actually, my very first entrepreneurial experience, that was the setup, was here on North Campus, just not at the College of Engineering. It was at the Gerald Ford Library here on campus. And I woke up one day, read the Michigan Daily when I was a freshman, friend and I, and we read that President Carter and President Ford were hosting a group of dignitaries from around the world to talk about democracy building. So we just decided to show up, and we figured maybe we could sneak in with all the other kids trying to get there. Not another student was there, and we wandered in. Sometime during one of the breaks, one of the people came up to us, clearly realizing we weren't there, and was like, hey, we'd love to talk with you. And we started talking about students and the importance of young people to democracy and so forth. And later that day, President Ford asked us to write a presentation on the role of students and young people in the role of democracy. And we presented it the next day, and a few weeks later, I got my first job in Washington, D.C. for the summer, unpaid, unfortunately, developing the student wing of this organization, which was called the International Committee for a Community of Democracies. So it was quite an interesting experience, and I had already at that time in my life very much dedicated my focus to international affairs and conflict, largely as a result of a trip to East Berlin, so I'm dating myself here, when I was in high school, and seeing that. Also, while I was here on campus doing my liberal arts thing, I became very interested in this idea of identity, which is something that I've really spent the better part of my career focused on. And I was particularly triggered by this idea of Generation X. This kid is a name that had kind of come out while I was here at college, and I was just so offended by it. I was like, what the hell is Generation X? Like, what does this even mean? And I learned that, that it was sort of being imposed on us by the media and people from other generations and so forth. So I was just constantly complaining about it. And my friends, who were just getting tired of hearing my rant about Generation X, finally suggested my senior year I should write a proposal for a graduation speech based on it. And lo and behold, it got accepted. And so I gave the speech, and it wasn't until just a few years ago that I ever went back to read it again, not having fully realized how much I had already thought through some of these ideas. And I thought it'd be worth sharing 3 of them, and I'll read them quickly in my best graduation speaker voice. It is a dangerous thing to let others tell you who you are. No one can understand the complexities that make up the mind and soul of another individual. Such attempts to define a person usually fall short. They limit rather than capture essence. Do such attempts to simplify our diverse character affect us? Identity is not simply a composite of the past. We can be identified as much by where we are going as where we have been. This may be the more important task in this process because it is the part over which you and I have control. I encourage you to be active and thoughtful in defining our generation, because if we do not define ourselves, experience has shown that someone else will. So, off of my liberal arts, poli-sci, foreign policy type approach, I went off to DC, managed to get a paid internship out of the University of Michigan's application process to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was a lot of fun. And I spent a few years there focused on the crisis in Bosnia, the crisis in Rwanda. I had a chance to work with Richard Holbrooke and some others who were really doing some very cutting edge stuff. But my first real entrepreneurial experience came one day in response to sort of the world's inability to do these things. The president of the Carnegie Endowment, named Morton Abramowitz, asked me to come take notes in a meeting that was designed to start a new nonprofit. And I never forget, because I walked into the room and I saw Robert McNamara sitting there, and I was like, I didn't even know he was still alive. I was like, I've always seen him in these pictures from like the 1960s. And lo and behold, I sat in a room with him, a few other people, and took notes on this idea of the International Crisis Group, which was At that time, and again, you have to remember, this was pre-internet, at least broadly distributed, and certainly pre-smartphone, and it was very difficult to get information out of these fast-moving crises around the world, and so ICG was designed to do that. And when the meeting was over, I was going to write up the notes, and they were like, do us one better, help write a business plan for it. So my last 18 months at the Carnegie Endowment were spent helping to write the business plan, helping to raise money, helping to hire a team. We set it up initially in London. It's now based in Brussels, and just having the time of my life. But I found during that experience that I had always been an amateur technologist, and it was a time when technology and data and various things were starting to really emerge through the internet. And I had a chance to work with my dad, who he was out of construction. He was an entrepreneur himself, but not in tech. He had actually run into a really cool underground imaging technology at Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and that led to an effort to map the underground. And what I mean by that is sort of like taking an MRI type scan for the first sort of 5 to 10 feet under the ground to look for anything from pipes and cables prior to construction, to environmental waste, to even landmines. And I had my first mini exit. One of the investor groups decided to buy me out a year and a half in, so I got really excited about that and took a year off to do an executive MBA at the University of Chicago in Barcelona. But ultimately, the company was a technical success, but really a commercial failure. As Christine mentioned, we were actually named the Software Innovation of the Year by the Wall Street Journal, which you would just think money would come pouring in and markets would open. But it turned out that it really was very expensive to deploy this imaging technology, so the company really could not show a path to profitability. But in the course of doing that, I was exposed personally, because I was not doing the geophysics and all the signal processing algorithms that the scientific team was. I started working with the more advanced mapping tools that had come out in GIS, and got very excited about this idea of mapping and what a powerful interface maps were for understanding our world and understanding the world around us. So I started the Map Network with, it turned out, 2 refugees from Bosnia that I had met after my work in Bosnia after the end of the war. And we at the Map Network pioneered this rich online mapping with interactive layers and content. And much of what you experience today in Google Maps and things like this, we were really at the cutting edge of doing that. We also managed to get a great early partnership with Condé Nast Traveler magazine, and had a whole slew of travel map, online and print even, and mobile maps set to launch on September the 30th, 2001. And our offices were across the street from the World Trade Center, our New York offices. We were also based in DC with a sight line to the plume of smoke that came up from the plane hitting the Pentagon. And our travel map business was over overnight. Condé Nast literally asked for their money back on some things they had prepaid. And even our investors said, if you kind of did the right thing, you might give the rest of the money you've raised back, which we had only raised a few $100,000 at that point. But it turned out we couldn't get in our building there on Broadway. It was closed. And we ourselves were trying to make sense of this craziness happening in Lower Manhattan. So we just used our travel map, our online travel map for New York, and started layering in everything from where you could donate blood to where you could stay in a shelter to which roads were open and closed, et cetera. And pretty soon, it became the most used map of these relief and rescue efforts. And we had to actually give the files out hourly at certain points. Media companies were hosting it as it was being used on the front page of FEMA and the Red Cross and around the world. And so we found this really interesting niche in what we call place-based or venue mapping with event information on it. And it turned out a kind of pedestrian industry called destination marketing, like convention and visitor bureaus, got kind of excited about that. And so we started putting the tools in their hands to start really bringing to life their destinations that they marketed. And it was a nice little profitable business. We didn't really have to raise any more money. And what I realized in doing this was that we were part of this effort, a much bigger effort, to rebuild the real world, like this building, digitally on a one-to-one scale. And that was our view of it, was like, let's put the tools in the hands of people who actually run or manage or work or live in these places. They know the most about it. They're not map makers, but let's give them tools that let them create professional quality maps that ultimately were navigable. And then it became the world's largest location data platform. And that was largely the result of us being acquired by Navtech, which was my first real exit. And it was a very exciting one. And that was in 2006. And Navtech had been famous for driving the roads for 17 years. Talking about a bad business model. They didn't turn a profit for 17 years, but managed to get strategic backing from Philips Electronics and some others as they finished driving the roads and building out their database. But we had figured out how to build the layers of richness on top of it, and we got this great exit. They were a publicly traded company. We were so excited. And then like 8 months later, I was told that Nokia was buying Navtech, and it was the weirdest thing. I thought they were a Japanese company when I first heard of them. I didn't even know a publicly traded company could be acquired by another publicly traded company. I thought you went public, so you didn't get acquired. And it was a real curveball for those of us who had really wanted to be part of mapping the future, and suddenly we're inside the world's largest mobile phone company, at least at that time. And after a while, being the data guy inside Nokia, I got this interesting assignment. What to do with personal data coming off the devices of 1.2 billion people. And I was asked to think about this in their offices in Berlin, a few, maybe 8-10 blocks away from the former Stasi headquarters, which I had seen when the Stasi were still there. And my partner from, one of my partners from the MAP network who'd been in Sarajevo and I went to dinner that night, and we realized that what we were really talking about here was mapping people, and that this was the beginning of an effort to rebuild us digitally on a one-to-one scale. And so we had this idea for Personal. And Personal, we all left as a team to start an effort, and this was 2009, so we're talking a decade ago now, to think about this data-driven future that we're all living in and what it might look like to build the tools and the platform that put the individual at the center of this equation. It was the only sort of logical thing that we could come up with that seemed ethical, sustainable, et cetera. And we imagined, what would the world have looked like if the Stasi 20 years earlier had real-time information on 1.2 billion people and who they were talking to and what they were reading and where they were going, et cetera, what they were purchasing. And it really struck us, and we decided we wanted to figure out how to put people in charge of their data. And so we raised some money. It was interesting. I probably could have gotten any map-related business funded on the literal back of a napkin. But when I told all of my friends and professional colleagues that I wanted to work on this problem, I literally had them say, "Why are you taking this amazing career and flushing it down the drain?" And that was my nicer friends who were being honest with me. Some of the less friendly things came out in other ways. But we were really serious about building the world's first privacy by design platform. And privacy by design means we didn't want to touch, hold, or see the data ourselves. We really wanted to create an architecture where the individual had full and complete agency over their data to use how they wanted. And you'll see we did a number of different things around that. But one of the things that came out then was Facebook was going public, and there was a lot of attention on the value of personal data for the first time. And I got a call from a journalist from the Wall Street Journal, and she asked me what I thought about that. And I said, if you really think about it, personal data is a new form of currency. And ended up on the, again, back when people read print newspapers, above the fold front page, 2011. All my team was like, "What do you mean by that?" I'm like, "I'm not quite sure, but it sounded really good," and she liked it. But the bottom line with Personal was that we failed. We did not get consumers or individuals to care. We couldn't come up with enough a use case, something, an incentive that got people to actually care. And it was also, super early. It was very hard to collect and aggregate your own data. We almost got there on a really cool advanced form filling application. We had real-time private context syncing. We created a data vault, which is now a big part of what I'm still working on. But we could not get consumer adoption. And we raised $30 million from tier 1 VCs who finally we convinced to put money in over 6-7 years and just couldn't get traction. But we did along the way invent some important pieces that are thankfully now starting to prove relevant. One of them was a reverse license agreement. And the reverse license agreement is the idea that rather than you signing someone else's license agreement when you use their app, which usually gives them full permission to track you and do whatever they want with your data, the exact opposite. It says if I'm capable of giving you, and I do give you, data. That data is mine, and you can only use it for the purpose that you have said that you're going to use it for. And it turned out we ended up even building a friendship with, at the time, the head of the US Patent and Trademark Office, who agreed that this sort of reverse license agreement was the way to go. Problem was, no one had data to give apps, but at least we had the legal formula down. We did also start to, through some hackathons, show that apps powered by people's data, where the person could give data, was a good idea. We had some really cool early ideas that got built. Again, there wasn't enough good data, there wasn't enough of use cases to make it fly, but people were, developers definitely got excited by this, and our API got a lot of trial and tests from it. We also spent a lot more time than I think we ever thought we would helping with the nascent movement to have people think about their privacy, identity, and their control of data as a human right. And I remember I wrote a blog post saying that your privacy and data is a human right, and even like human rights people were like, you are just not doing us any favors. How could something like that ever be on the same level as real human rights? People in Silicon Valley thought even less of the idea. But we were out publishing and telling those stories. We also, in the course of it, did end up building the very best privacy by design tech and team. And that led in 2017 to us merging with a company out of the UK called DigiMe. And DigiMe was very similar to Personal. They started a few years after us, and the thing they really got right, besides being in Europe, which was really a big part of what they got right, was they just imagined that you would never actually manually create data. You would just plug into more and more sources. And they came out at a time when there were more and more APIs where you could get data about yourself out of it. Very exciting. And we did a merger despite our early stages. And that merger now, as Christine said, I lead the North American operations for that, and globally sort of our app developer and app ecosystem work. And things are starting to change. You've probably heard of GDPR in Europe, which is their new privacy legislation, which came out in May of last year. And the digital world did not end, as a lot of people said it would. And then even more interesting to me was the fact that 3 people, including 2 real estate developers in California, got a privacy initiative on the ballot in California, and it passed in a landslide, despite all of the attempts by industry to oppose it. And you may be noticing now, I saw it during the game last night, Apple had a commercial about the iPhone and privacy, and they're seeing this even as good business to drive a wedge, but with their competitors. But I couldn't have been more excited to see the language they're using of calling privacy a fundamental human right. 3-4 years earlier, just was laughed out of the room saying things like this, and now it's part of their marketing message. And so what does DigiMe do? It is a private sharing platform. You don't need your data for the sake of having your data. You want your data, and I now have hundreds of thousands of data points on myself coming from, literally most of these. My credit cards, I have a Fitbit, health records, my social data, my Spotify, my YouTube watching, etc. All of this data is in this single data vault that is under my control. It's all encrypted. The data is normalized and standardized to be reused. And the company doesn't touch, hold, or see the data. My personal data is inside Dropbox. It's where my data is stored, but it's already encrypted and just sort of lives there for when I log in and need to use it. And this is just a simple schematic. I thought sometimes getting a mental model for what I mean by this can help. There's all this data out there in these silos and apps and companies, et cetera. And we're plugging into APIs and doing various things to try to allow that data to get pulled in and normalized inside your DigiMe app, stored where you want. And then the private sharing with new apps and services. And I'll tell you about a couple of those here. So you've all used, or maybe you've used, you should use, personal financial management apps. But it's scary because they all look at your data, and many of them are selling that data or trading it for offers and marketing and things like this. Finsights is a very rich, interesting personal financial management app that looks across your data without the data ever leaving your device. You download it, it's an iPhone app or an Android app. It decrypts through your logged in session on your DigiMe app, comes out of your personal cloud, and gets analyzed right there for you to use. Happy, not happy. This was one that is pretty interesting. It looks at your last 2 years of your social posts and does sentiment analysis using a machine learning library and rates your posts whether or not they're happy, angry, or neutral, or sad. And the first time I did this, it was pretty funny looking at November 2016 and just how angry my post suddenly became. They've chilled out some, but it's a really powerful new world of personal analytics and understanding your data. And then this is one that I thought would be really fun for you guys. TFP stands for that effing post. A developer in one of our hackathons, brilliant guy, we just could tell how talented he was. And we're like, what are you doing, man? And he's like, I'm never going to get a job. Like, you really look good. We may like to hire you. Why not? He's like, you have no idea of what I've put online in the last 10 years, man. I should have never had a phone in my hands posting every thought that came to my mind. So he built I think at present it's 8,000 words and phrases that you import your entire history from 5 leading social networks. It privately in their app, nothing, phones home, scans and identifies those potentially objectionable words and phrases and gives you a workflow. You swipe left if you're like, yes, I did mean to say that and I'm not embarrassed about it, or swipe right if you're like, whoa, I need to go through later and clean that up, and gives you an automatic deep link into those posts so you can do that. What's interesting about this app is crazy idea, I'd never even thought of it. It's going to get distributed soon by a major job search site. Because if you think about job search companies, and by the way, they're generally bad actors in the world of surveilling you and doing all the current things. They don't want your entire lifetime of social data, but they do want you to get the job that you apply for. So they're going to make this available and pay for it for people applying. UBDI. So I mentioned Dana earlier. This is another really cool, exciting app that's been built on DigiMe, and it's tackling one of the hardest problems there is, which is helping you figure out the economic value of your data and giving you a chance to participate in those economics. And unlike all of these other apps, it really is about the money, and we are very focused on figuring out exactly what your data is worth, and there's a lot of really smart people, including some professors I met with today here on campus, trying to figure this out. Nobody really knows. Is your personal data worth tens of dollars a year to you, hundreds of dollars? We think at UBDI it's worth thousands of dollars. And so we're introducing this concept of universal basic data income. When you think of the trillions of dollars, double-digit trillions of dollars of market capitalization that's being generated in Silicon Valley and elsewhere, that wouldn't be possible without your personal data. We think that it's time for people to be able to reclaim that. Some part of that, not all of it. There's a lot of value-added stuff that's good too. And UBDI is going to market in the $50 billion market research industry, which wasn't even an initial focus of the company. And it kind of shocked me when I got my mind around the idea of how big that industry was. But it turned out in user testing, people were more comfortable with market research because market researchers don't want to know about you personally. They want to know about people like you and how much coffee do you buy on days that you take 12,000 or more steps and things like this. And so today, we are here on campus. It just was perfect timing. We are opening the beta invitations for UBDI, and we're inviting you guys and anyone here on campus to download it. It needs some polishing and some TLC, as we say. So for any of you who've ever launched apps, the expression that you learn more in the first 30 days of launching your app than you spend the entire time building it. So we appreciate your feedback and your participation in this. And then we're going to offer 3,000 tokens. Let me explain the tokens for a moment. It's basically like your share in the community data. So we're expecting to have hopefully hundreds of thousands and then even millions of people in the future who are members of this community and who are able to opt their data into various research studies. And the tokens serve as your stake in that community. And being a beta user, we're offering quite a large number of those early on. We'd encourage you to hold on to them rather than trading them when they're available to be traded. But ubdi.co is where it's just gone live today. You can download it, try it. You'll need a DigiMe because actually to the whole model I've been describing, UBDI doesn't want your original sensitive data. They just want to do analytics on your data to see how much coffee you drank on days that you took 12,000 steps and market that data to the people that might buy it. And then finally, I know there's some developers in the audience. We're also do a virtual hackathon just for students. And these are some of the prizes that we give. It's just a new day, and we want people to be able to think through. We don't know all the use cases, and this is beyond UBDI. This is actually all of those other apps that you saw before. There's about 50 in the pipeline right now, getting built by others. We think UBDI tokens are hopefully a good incentive for trying it out. You could build an app in a few days, and if you get an app published in a store, in Android or the App Store, you'd get 15,000 tokens just for doing it. So maybe a nice way to spend some late nights, maybe not before the exams, but soon after. So this is what I hear they're calling you guys, and you know, I welcome you guys to start thinking about how to take control of your identity. Thank you very much. Woohoo!
Good job. What else?
Thank you. Hey, how are you? Hi.
Thank you. I'm going out there with them.
Okay.
Thank you, Shane. Oh, thank you very much. Well, you know, we have a lot of speakers who come in, and there's a lot of specialty areas that they kind of work within, and their startups are pretty highly focused. But I think what's so interesting about this is that you clearly, and it applies to everyone, there's not a single person in this room who doesn't have an interest in their data online, the ownership of it, the potential value of it, et cetera. To that extent, to play to the crowd at hand, what would you speculate the average valuation is for a student's data online?
Well, so there's a couple questions in that. I mean, what is your current value of your data today? And we're actually taking a pretty hard look at that right now. I think it's clearly worth thousands of dollars a year today when you look across all the use cases. Facebook and Google together, you know, generate probably $160, $70 a year, $80 actually, $180 a year from your data. But what's interesting is the market capitalization on that's, you know, 15, 18 times that. So they actually, your data to them is already worth thousands of dollars. And they're just a drop in the bucket compared to all of the places your data is getting used. So I think that's one of the more interesting parts of this experiment is figuring it out. And you know, we chose the name UBDI very carefully because we wanted to communicate that this wasn't just for, you know, something we were doing so you could get a little extra beer money, as nice as that might be. We really think this is a fundamental part of the movement for people to participate in the economics that technology is enabling, and in this case, data. So I would say, you know, thousands of dollars a year for an average person.
Yeah, I'm going to let out a secret that you did spend that beer money at Pizza House last night.
I did, yes. It was, for those of you who may not, I'm sure none of you are following my Twitter feed, I went to Pizza House last night and was looking for the house. And there was no house anymore. It's apparently been torn down and part of a big building. Yes, times have changed. I was told that repeatedly.
Thank you. Kind of going off of that, I was also wondering, how would you say your company's marketable to people who might trust their data in a different service, such as Google, that use that right now?
How would it be
marketable to those
marketable? So it's interesting. You know, we've been told that the price of participating in the digital world is basically our data and privacy, right? I can't tell you how many times I've sat on stages like this, sitting across from, you know, people you know who've built great companies and great apps. And they said, look, if they cared about privacy, they wouldn't be using Facebook or they wouldn't be using Google. And you're like, oh, right, yeah, I remember that other private social network that all my friends are on that I can connect with, and that other private search engine. Actually, I encourage you to use DuckDuckGo. That is starting to do a great job. But they haven't existed. So these have been sort of false arguments in that the system was designed from the very beginning to capture data, surveil you, and monetize it. So our thinking here is that there's going to be a whole new range of apps. In fact, you're going to see one that takes your data and filters search. It's kind of obvious, right? Google and search engines have indexed the world, but we're helping you privately index yourself. And we think we can create far more relevant search results when your data is used privately to filter search. So I think at the end of the day, as much as people might care about privacy and being in control of their data, it's not going to be until actual apps like a better search engine that also doesn't track you is available. And I think that's the moment in time that we're in. So, you know, I've spent a decade telling anyone who will listen, hey, you should care about your privacy and come try apps. And I've gotten a lot of people to try apps that they were like, yeah, you know, didn't really do much for me. And seeing developers and overnight in a hackathon come up with an app like TFP, which I just think is such a fun idea. In fact, we were trying to get him to change the name because we're like, that's not really that. He's like, nope, it's TFP. And we're like, you won't get it in the App Store. He's like, let's try. And he did. So it's in the App Store. But I think it's going to be apps like that people actually find real value in that gets them to change.
For sure. Thank you.
You know, to your point about the app development and the spin-off that's going to end up happening with this, and the quote that you had on there about personal data being the new currency, when you're thinking about the comparison of the age we're in now and the value of personal data as we go forward, how does it compare to the dot-com boom? How does it compare to what happened in the early 2000s, late 90s? And how would you say Digime is getting ahead of the rest of the market to take advantage of the opportunity ahead?
Well, it's interesting. You know, it's not always the case that people that see something first are the winners. I mean, Facebook didn't see social networking first. There were things like Friendster out there which completely failed technically. And then there was MySpace, which I'm sure you've heard of. They failed in terms of identity. They let everybody create fake identities, and it got a lot of adoption, but it ultimately failed compared to Facebook, who I think Mark Zuckerberg, looking at that problem, said, hey, I think it's got to work technically, which Friendster failed at, and it's got to be based generally on real identities. And so he got the model right and became Facebook. But that was years after social networking had first been invented. So it's not a foregone conclusion that DigiMe will be the platform everyone in the world builds on. In fact, because we're so passionate about interoperability and data portability, we don't believe in locking people in. We think there will be other systems that emerge. But we've spent 10 years getting ready for this, and we're the first company that can actually deliver on truly private, truly secure apps today that leverage this kind of data. So it's an exciting moment, and so that's why all I care about talking about these days is people who have cool ideas and things they can build. Again, the hardest part's coming up with the idea, not building it. It's actually becoming pretty trivial with our SDK and things like this to build the apps. It's really coming up with the idea and then convincing other people to use it. That's the second big piece, right? And so we're hoping we're at the right time and right place. But yeah, every time people who have not heard of DigiMe are like, oh man, you guys are so lucky that you were here. Like the whole world's starting to care about this. It is a little ironic given that it's been 10 years of kind of walking in the desert to get here.
And then kind of overall picture, do you think complete control of our data and total privacy is actually ever possible, or is that a sort of utopian dream that might not actually ever happen?
I think it's somewhere in between. So I think this is a great question. And I think when companies particularly hear about users being in control and owning their data, they're like, oh my God, like what does that mean for my business? There'll be there'll be nothing left. And that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that if you think about it, right, you have the competitive advantage. If you're just thinking about it in terms of raw, like who can bring the most good data together about you. If you have the right tools, you have the ability to do that. So if you're just talking about how do we bring the most data to solve data-driven problems and services in the future, be that AI-driven, machine learning, and things like personalized medicine, things we really care about seeing happen, you actually have a better ability technically and legally to do that than Facebook or Google on their worst day or best day or whatever you want to call it. That's exciting, and I think in that regard, this model is going to emerge. That's why we've believed in it for so long. But to your privacy point and to what happens to those folks out there with data, we think that there's going to be, we've kind of been on this race to the bottom when it comes to privacy and ownership and control of data for the last 15, 20 years. We think this is the beginning of a race to the top. And you see this around things where, like organic foods, you guys are too young to remember, but that was laughed at by lots of people. And then suddenly Whole Foods is out, and people are like, yeah, I've been reading these studies, and I actually care about this. I don't mind paying a little more for it. And next thing you know, and everyone's saying, no, people never pay another 60 cents for eggs like that. And guess what? They did. And I think we're going to see that now, where people are competing based on the value they can create on your data, but also the trust, the transparency, and their ability to do the right things with your data, to not go selling it out the back door. I think that has a massively positive impact on privacy and in sort of draining the swamp, if you will, of these bad practices. And all things being equal, wouldn't you rather use a search engine that's not tracking you and selling your data out the back door? All things being equal.
So you referenced what's going on in the EU, you referenced what's going on in California. There was a USA Today article about this a couple weeks ago with Gavin Newsom the governor of California, looking at what they can do to actually create laws to provide for data ownership. Yep. What governments are working or favorable to this that maybe we haven't heard of? And then secondly, what companies and large corporate entities out there are also favorable that maybe we just haven't seen in the news?
It's a great question. Well, I'll stay in the US for a moment. I've already mentioned the fact in Europe, well, I'll start with Europe. Europe looks at this totally differently. And it was a surprise to me when I heard about DigiMe the first time and started to see their growth. And I was like, we're doing all this technical stuff they're not doing yet. They haven't even built pieces of this yet. And I was like, what's going on in Europe? And I'd spent a lot of time in Europe in my Nokia days, but I really had been focused in the US. And the movement for more transparency and control of data and privacy in Europe was very organic. It wasn't just some regulators who got around and had a conference and said, you know what, this is bad for people and we're going to impose privacy. which is kind of what industry tried to make it sound like. It wasn't. It was just average people going, you know, this is really creeping me out, and we're not so far removed from people's identity and data about them being used in really horrific ways. And so they passed GDPR, and it's been wildly catalyzing of these new ideas. And so when I look at the US, and you mentioned Governor Newsom in California, one of the more interesting dynamics there is that the speed and velocity of that law that passed in California, which is, by the way, an imperfect law, and it's as is GDPR. This is the first, Rev 1.0 of these efforts. But the speed and velocity of that and the popular support shocked people here in the US. They thought this European thing was just a European thing, and they had no idea that Americans are actually caring at the same level, and they'd vote in those numbers to support it. And so now what you see is a few things. One, politicians are realizing this is good politics, and I think it's bipartisan. What's interesting to me is that you have senators like Senator Hawley, and I think he's from Missouri. I mean, that's all he talks about. You hear him, and he's a Republican, and you'd think the only issue in the world is privacy and control of data, and he'll bring it into any event that he's talking about. It's amazing. But industry meaning mostly big tech, but mostly big tech, they are lobbying up, and I shouldn't say lawyering up, but that too. They are hiring armies of lobbyists to try to create false partisan issues where there aren't. They're trying to position the Democrats as being, populists who care about privacy, and that responsible Republicans who care about business and innovation don't. But that's just not true. I mean, tests show Republicans actually have more sensitivity to being tracked and the impact on their freedom than Democrats. So it's like the industry just really stirring the pot. And then in the case of California, where Governor Newsom came flat out and said, I want...
A Democrat.
What's that?
A Democrat.
A Democrat, yeah, and a pretty left-leaning Democrat, said, I want there to be a digital dividend, and he used those terms. And what struck me about that, and by the way, there's precedent, like there's an oil dividend in Alaska if you live there, and it's a lot of money that you get every year. What was interesting to me is if he had called for greater privacy, there would have been 100 news releases in the next hour out of all the industry associations that are shilling for these companies who don't want privacy. But there was just crickets after he called for a digital dividend. People didn't even know what he meant. And they were like, okay, let's just hope no one paid attention, or I don't even know what they were thinking. They were not prepared for the concept of a governor of the state that was most tied to technology saying that citizens should participate in the economics. And he cited their personal data. I mean, he was talking about this. And I just think that, sometimes there are market failures in government. I'm not actually a big regulatory, fanatic myself. I like to see innovation. I mean, I've dedicated my life to doing innovative new things. And I worry greatly, in fact, that regulation done wrong could actually lock in the power of incumbents and limit startups like us. But in this case, I have to say I'm very excited by the role government's playing in shining a light on these problems and hopefully passing some smart legislation around it.
That's great. I know we could talk on this topic forever, but we do want to get to student questions.
I do. I've got one like chomping at the bit.
Oh, chomping at the bit.
Yes.
Hey,
Thank
Mr.
you.
White Sweatshirt, what do you got?
Hello, I'm Dennis Gulari.
Hi.
I had a quick question regarding sort of the attitudes in the industry of digital privacy and stuff. I know it's not a one-to-one connection, but did you feel there was any change in those attitudes following the events surrounding like Snowden and the NSA? And did you feel like any of those false arguments or people who felt like, well, this doesn't matter to us, did that change at all in your industry?
So what's interesting about this question, thanks for it, we've been talking for a decade. I think the term that got really adopted was like a digital Pearl Harbor. Like what needed to happen that would get people to wake up and care about their privacy? And there were various moments. Snowden was certainly one of them, but also the Target credit card breach, a number of these things where people were like, oh, this is the moment everyone's going to care about privacy, Equifax getting hacked. Facebook going public initially. That was when I started speaking about these issues out in the open. And people cared, but they didn't really seem to care too much. What changed on this were two things, and they were very tied together. The 2016 election and people understanding that Cambridge Analytica and the Russians, among others, weaponized these platforms to distribute misinformation and to manipulate people based on very personal, very specific targeting criteria. it really scared people. And people, regardless of your politics, people are like, yeah, we don't know that that's okay. And the fact that Facebook sat on that information for 2+ years without disclosing it, I mean, you may have noticed there's been criminal investigations that have just opened around this. I mean, if I had lost your credit card number and sat on that information for 2 years, I would already be in jail. So to lose tons of data, this is more in the Cambridge Analytica context, is a big deal. Interestingly, the Russians didn't steal data or hack data. The Russians used Facebook as it was intended. I mean, the 2016 or 2015, 16, and 17 reporting numbers for Facebook include money from the Russians. I mean, they just bought the targeting tools and targeted people. So in that regard, I would say that we've had this awakening, and I'm seeing it across industry. I was with the big bank yesterday in San Francisco, and C-suite level people cared. And that wasn't the case a few years ago. And it's first and foremost because as individuals, and this is the same way it was in Europe, people are going, yeah, this isn't okay, this has to change. We need a new model. We want data. We want data-driven futures. We don't want to be manipulated in ways that are not clear to us or at all. But we need transparency and we need agency over the data.
Outstanding. Well, I hate to call it, but
No,
it's
but
119.
I want to call attention to the fact, I think it's poignant that you referred to data and privacy as really a digital Pearl Harbor moment. It's also poignant that you likened maybe the realization of your journey with the relief and rescue efforts from the mapping of Lower Manhattan. That's not what you did it for, but that was another example of a
What'd
digital
you
Pearl
guys
Harbor.
think about Shane and UBDI and DigiMe today? Yeah! Whoa, yeah!
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Shane.
Thanks for having me, guys.